What's the worst form of torture to have ever existed? Being broken on the wheel. You're tied to a cartwheel that's resting on the ground. Then all of your limbs and joints are smashed with a hammer. Ankles, shins, knees, hips, hands, wrists, elbows. Then the wheel is turned up ways and rotated. All your broken bones and sinew continue to cause internal damage, but none of your important organs are. So you live for a long time, like a bag of pain, broken and screaming, until you die of blood loss or exhaustion. I don't know if it has an exact name, but you are ground up to your neck, unable to move or anything, and only your head is out so you can breathe. Then they put water and sugar on your head to attract flies that will eat your flesh and deposit their eggs inside you, and when they hatch, the maggots will eat you from inside out, if you are not dead by then. I accidentally took my 9-year-old into the torture museum in Siena. A woman outside in a jolly ye olde style costume was handing out family passes. Inside, a man acted out having his bare legs put into a bucket of boiling tar. He was left there until the tar hardened. It was peeled off along with all of his skin, and then rags soaked in vinegar were wrapped around the raw oozing flesh. It wasn't quite the London dungeon experience we were expecting. They'd tie a cauldron with a bunch of rats to your torso. Then heat the cauldron until the rats got scared and tried to dig through the victim's guts to escape. In another, they'd throw you in a pit with a bunch of starved rats. If you fell asleep, they'd try to eat you alive. Everyone's talking about old torture styles, but not many current day ones. Like when people inject you with adrenaline so you stay conscious and live longer while they things to you that would have killed you otherwise. There's a video out there, which I wish I hadn't watched, of a man tortured to death in this fashion. You really can't see anything in the video. It starts after the torture and all you can tell is that there is a bloody body. But you can hear the cartel guys speaking in Spanish. They had cut off his hands and skinned his face. And he wasn't moving, but he wasn't dead. They tried to cut his throat with a farm tool that was dull. When they started, that's when I shut it off. I should know better than to click on a link like that. It's not the imagery that's the worst. It's the way the men are so passive about it in their conversation about it. Like it's just a Tuesday at work. Hanged, drawn and quartered. First, you are attached to a wooden panel and dragged to the spot of your execution by horse. Then you are hung to almost the point of death. Next, you are let down and strapped to a table while your insides, and sometimes your essential organs, are removed and burnt in a fire before you, while you are still alive and able to see. Finally, you are beheaded, and then your body is quartered and put on display in prominent parts of the country to remind others to kindly not commit treason. Brazen bull. You're cooked alive. May I add more info? It's a rim. Don't remember what it's called, but in the 18th century, in England, people put so-called witches on a spiky chair covered in salt. Very painful. Then drowned them in water for 2 minutes. Those who didn't die counted as witches and got burned. Judas cradle. Conference calls. I think you mean teleconference calls. I can roll my eyes on a conference call. When they can see me, I have to pretend to be interested in it. Either the brazen bull or the canoes. The canoes is the hapless prisoner tied to a canoe, covered in honey, and set adrift into a nearby swamp. The insects will immediately be attracted by the honey and eat them alive from the front. And once they start pissing and shitting themselves, they'll be eating alive from the back too. The one where they make drops of water fall on your head while you can't move. I tried it with some friends and a safford. It is incredibly unnerving after only 10 minutes. I can only imagine how it is being there for days. They did this method in an episode of Mythbusters. It's called Chinese water torture. They did it on Kari and you could tell it was bad for her. I think all of the methods that are appalling but end in death are pretty gruesome. But I think the long-term psychological ones would be far worse. Solitary confinement in the dark for years and years? That's the stuff of nightmares. Yes. It's so strange that we don't take into account the length of time of the punishment. At least at first glance. You could argue that lengthy prison sentences are an extreme form of punishment because they drag on for years and years. In the US, we're very fond of them for a wide range of offenses. We tend to think that less than 10 years is no punishment at all. Yet so many people are willing to kill themselves rather than do time. I had a friend that did like a week in jail and was probably looking at another 30 days. And he was talking about becoming a fugitive to avoid it. Being burned at the stake may seem awful. But how long before you suffocate, experience nerve damage, or lose consciousness? Compare that with crucifixion, which starts out with a fair amount of pain. That will continue for days. How long into that punishment would you seriously consider allowing someone to start a fire beneath you and end it? If you were given the option? How about immurement, and specifically the Mongolian type? What they seem to have done is to put a prisoner in a box that forced in a very uncomfortable position. Said position would not let the prisoner either lie down or sit. Said box had a hole where the prisoner's head and possibly some limbs were chained, thus forcing them to be exposed. They then dragged the box in the middle of the desert and left the prisoner there without any food or water. Death would eventually occur due to starvation and or dehydration, but not before the prisoner experienced the intense heat and pecking of vultures. Wikipedia states that this was used well into the 20th century, and I seem to recall a very characteristic picture of said box from National Geographic. Brown rats. The victim was completely restrained and tied to the ground or a bed. The victim would then have many slits cut in their stomach. The torturer would place rats and trap them with a bowl on the victim's stomach. Then place hot coal on top of the bowl and the rats would get hot. A few seconds would go by and they would go into your stomach. Gnawing the intestines usually resulted in a few hours of agonizing pain for the victim. L'oubliatoire. Oubli in French means to forget. Often a castle would have basements and sub-basements, and often one hole in the very bottom of the basements that either you could not escape by climbing or you were locked in. They'd drop you in it and forget about you. You'd die from starvation or thirst, and often would live long enough to go out of your mind in the dark. Dank, wet, cold, rat-filled hole. When they place you on a rim. It's called the Saddam Hussein. Made famous eponymously. A mercury thermometer is forced all the way up your urethra, and then a nice man takes a hammer to the whole shebang. Lots of fun extracting that puppy. When mercury poisoning is the least of your worries. I once heard an expert on torture describe what he thought was the worst. The victim is laid down on a flat table with their bare feet overhanging the edge, with the ankles tied. The soles of the feet are beaten over and over with flat clubs. It takes a long time, but long after the pain stops. You keep beating until all the muscular structure is destroyed. And then you turn the victim loose. Most of their body is still intact. Their legs even work. But they can never walk again without the muscles in their feet. They will be in constant pain with sharp bursts anytime they move, as several bone-on-bone movements occur. And they have to live with knowing that they are now more of a burden to their society than a functioning member. Furthermore, since there isn't any disgusting imagery or even that much screaming, you can convince people to administer this torture without making them reluctant to continue. Wasn't there a method where you get your limbs tied together and then pulled apart by horses? Also, if I remember correctly, there is also another method where they put salt on your feet, chain you down, and let goats go to town on your feet. The eagle wing method was used in Nordic Europe and consisted of making two large cuts alongside the spine on the back of the victim. After the cut, they pulled their ribs out and made them look like wings. To make matters worse, they pulled the lung out and threw salt into the wounds. The punishment was painful and caused the victim to suffer for hours. I believe that was named a blood eagle, and there's been a decent amount of criticism whether it was ever performed, or if Vikings made it up to intimidate. Does mental anguish count as torture? During the Second Sino-Japanese War, if you were a man with a family, sometimes they would pay your wife and daughter in front of you, then force you to pay your own daughter, then kill them both. Then to top it off, they would throw your infant son in the air and catch him on a bayonet like a shish kebab. Imagine living the rest of your life after they did that to you. Many chose not to. Not really what OP was asking per se. But these were acts that had no purpose other than cruel torture, so I think it counts. In medieval times, adultery was dealt with by skinning the penis of the male and inserting it into the vagina of the female. The male would bleed to death from his skinless wiener and the woman would get a nasty infection and die. That has stuck with me for years. My vote goes out for the goats. You take rope and tie someone to a chair. Strap them down so that they move their legs or arms. Then take a big bucket of salt water, then dip their feet in it. Leave them like that for about a day with their feet just soaking in salt water. Once the day is up, kick the chair over so their feet are up in the air. Then bring in a goat. It'll find his salt-soaked feet and start licking. And it won't stop licking. It'll keep licking past the flesh and muscle all the way down to the bone. And you know what doesn't get bored? A goat licking salt. You can scream and try to kick, but that persistent salt licker won't give up. It will just stand then on all fours and lick at your feet with a coarse tongue for hours. The worst part is it's just the victim and a goat in a room. Nobody to plead with. Or confess to. Or bargain with. Just a goat that likes salt. That goat would be the most dedicated, hard-working, and empathetic torturer you've ever seen. The breaking wheel. There were two versions of this. One was simply crushing your legs, inch by inch, until you bled to death. And the other was breaking your limbs by wrapping them around the wagon spokes, then leaving you out to dry in the sun. Fun thing about leaving the punished out. Crows don't care if you're still alive. If you don't move for a few hours, they'll start eating your eyes. Another version has the condemned tied to a wheel. Then their arms and legs are smashed. Then the wheel is rolled around so that the condemned's limbs get all twisted and the broken bones do massive internal damage as the condemned's weight shifts around. I don't know what it's called, but the victim's hands would be tied behind their backs. And then they would be hung from a hook up high by their tied hands. They would have to hold themselves up for as long as they could, but when they finally gave in to the pain of it, snap. You hang them by their hands above their head. About 1.5 feet above the ground. No clothes. Put honey or other sweet object on their body. Release pig's boar into the enclosure with him. Then as the animals eat his feet, you slowly lower him so they can eat more and more. Good, because it gets rid of all the evidence. Pigs eat anything and everything. Solitary confinement while doing life without parole. In a former life, I was a corrections officer in a prison where there are dozens of guys in this position. There was a unit where they couldn't even yell to each other. Their only human contact was with a guard that walked by every hour and barely looked at them. Some guys did years in this state. The most horrendous part is that literally every shred of autonomy and freedom is gone. You can't even take your own life. They won't let you. I had inmates explain how this is the depth of despair. It's not the acute sting of physical pain. It's forced mental illness with literally no way out. Most of these men were violent criminals who'd committed horrible crimes. But it's still torture. Nubbing. Drunk guy told me this is what would happen to a person if they killed his family. Tie buddy up and cut the end of his pinky off at the first joint and explain why you're doing it. Bandage it up and let it heal. Continue the process on each joint of the body until they are just a torso and a head. Cut the tongue out. Blind them. And then repeat the reason you are doing it one final time before you blow their eardrums out. All that is left is a brain and a body that can't hurt anyone anymore. Let them sit like that forever. Double quote. Note to self. Don't kill Buddy's family. Impaling someone alive on pikes. I second this. The pikes were blunt, so they didn't pierce your vital organs. They made one hole through your colon, slid through your innards all the way to your collarbone, where they made another hole in that soft triangle below your neck. Optionally, the torturers would stick the pike through your jaw and out your mouth as well. But because there were only 2 well-sealed holes, you lived on the pike for days. All this makes Vlad the Impaler more terrifying. And you can understand why the Turks no-tried the FCK out of Transylvania. Completely fictional. As far as I know. But I saw some movie recently where they put a prisoner in this horizontal, rotating barrel. Probably about 5 feet in diameter. The barrel isn't quite a perfect cylinder, more octagonal or something. And it rotates constantly at a moderate pace. The prisoners inside the barrels had to constantly move at least a little bit to avoid being tossed around. I just thought that was so brutal. It's completely automated. 2. So that means zero chance for mercy or rest. Pretty sure being cooked alive in a cast iron bowl ranks up there alongside being boiled alive in a vat with other human beings that have already been boiled alive and broken down. Genghis Khan used to do that. I think being vivisected is also pretty gruesome. As well as what the English did to William Wallace. Like what they actually did to the poor guy. Not the Hollywood version that sounds pretty PG by comparison. Don't ask how I know this, but it's called the wooden donkey. It was a torture used in the medieval times, I think. But it was a wooden triangular standing about the height of a miniature donkey with a sharp blade along the top end. Then you were sat on it like a donkey and had tight straps pulling you down to it on your shoulders. And what it did was slowly cut you in half up the middle.